London. London is England's capital city, and I'm sure it's a place that you've all got an opinion of. But what did William Blake think about London? Let's find out. Hey everyone, it's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and I'm back with another poetry analysis video. In this one, we're going to look at London by William Blake, which is on page 6 of the WJEC Poetry Anthology. This poem is also included in another exam board's poetry anthology, so if your school sits the AQA English literature papers, then this video will also be of use for you, so please do watch. I do hope to eventually cover the AQA Power and Conflict anthology in its own series, although I don't think I'll be doing that for quite some time. As always, please make sure that you've got at least 3 different highlighters ready, as well as some extra pieces of paper in case you run out of space around your copy of the poem for notes. In this video, I'll go through William Blake's London in the same way that I've gone through Simon Armitage's The Manhunt and Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnet 43. If you haven't seen those videos yet, a link for my WJEC Eduqas Poetry Anthology playlist should be appearing in the top right corner of your screen about now. So in this video, I will read the poem. I will go through the poem's context. I'll provide a closer reading of the poem, discuss the poem's meaning, its mood and its motivation. I'll think about themes, and then finally at the end of this video there will be an optional revision task for you to complete too. To make sure that you don't miss out on a single one of these poetry analysis videos, please make sure that you drop it a like, subscribe to my channel, DystopiaJunkie, and click the notification bell too. Please do tell your friends and classmates about these videos too, because if they're helping you, they might help them too. Okay, so cringeworthy self-promotion aside, it's time to read the poem. Make sure to follow along on your copy in your anthology. London. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So there's the poem. And now for some context, which I hope you now know is equal to 1/3 of the marks in your GCSE paper. So although you may not need to know these exact dates, knowing that Blake was alive when the 18th century bled into the 19th century will allow you to consider that the world he lived in was very different to the one we live in today. Blake is famous for his poetry, paintings, and he was also famous as a printmaker. It is worth knowing that Blake didn't have all that great a reputation when he was alive. Many of his contemporaries thought he was mad, as he held views that were seen as somewhat peculiar, and maybe the views that we see in this poem weren't necessarily the common view of people of the time. Blake was a Londoner, meaning he knows the topic of this poem particularly well. Furthermore, Blake only stayed in school until he was 10, which perhaps could explain some of his idiosyncratic views. From a religious viewpoint, Blake and his family were English dissenters, which is a type of Protestantism that had separated from the Church of England because they disagreed with state interference. Blake had two major books of poetry called Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. The former book was a collection of positive poetry that focused on nature and childhood and gave him a reputation for being a romantic, and that's with a capital R. I'll do a bit more on that in a later video. The latter book was much more critical, cynical, and negative. He attacked the church, contemporary society, and the city. Perhaps unsurprisingly, London comes from this second book. Now, Blake initially supported the French Revolution, which is where everyday people overthrew the monarchy being the people who are in charge. But he eventually criticised it as it descended to chaos and violence. Blake wrote London during the Industrial Revolution. But what's the Industrial Revolution, I hear you say? Well, perhaps a bit simplistically, the Industrial Revolution was a time of mass change in London. Factories opened up all across the city, and the lower class, many of whom had come from more rural areas, took up jobs in them. These jobs were difficult, they were dangerous, and they were poorly paid. Of course, with more factories came a never-before-seen amount of pollution. London was covered in a thick black smog, and nature suffered because of this. As more and more people moved to London seeking work, class divisions increased. Before we get started annotating the poem, this is your reminder to get 3 highlighters and to set up your own key. You'll need 1 colour for imagery, 1 for language, and 1 for structure. Now, I said in my discussion of the last 2 poems that it's useful and important to have something to say about the titles of each anthology poem. However, for this poem, it's difficult to say anything really meaningful or of deep, insightful value. That being said, you can still squeeze something out of the poem's title. This poem's title establishes the topic, which, great, very useful. Most poems do that. However, if we look at and think about the title a little bit more, we could say that it's quite declarative and quite plain. That could suggest that this poem will simply show London as it really is, without too much decoration. Before we get too stuck in with the analysis of this poem, I thought I'd say that despite its age, this poem is relatively straightforward. There are a few reoccurring ideas that we'll see crop up time and time again in this poem, and once you've got your head around them, you should have a firm grasp of the poem. So for this quatrain, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 questions that I'd like to consider. So pause now if you'd like to have a go at making your own annotations. Okay, so chartered can have 2 different meanings. Starting with the less interesting meaning, chartered could refer to the amount of trade that was occurring in London at the time. During the Industrial Revolution, many different modes of transport were chartered, which means hired, to bring in products and materials to the city in order to satisfy the demand of the Industrial Revolution. Using this meaning, chartered could suggest that the streets and Thames were incredibly busy. However, chartered could also mean something else. It could refer to the increasing amount of political and economic control that was happening in London. A charter is a document that tells you who owns a plot of land. As Blake grew up, more and more charters were issued, meaning that around 6 million acres of land, including areas of nature and a relative wilderness, suddenly became somebody's property. banks made money from this, as did the landowners, who could do what they wanted with their property. As a romantic poet, in this case meaning a poet who celebrates and is in awe of nature, Blake was critical of this, and so by using chartered he is pointing out the ridiculousness of the idea of land that was previously free to the public becoming somebody else's property. Being critical of the increasing amount of control seen in London during the Industrial Revolution, Blake resorts to mockery in order to get his point across. He claims that the River Thames has also been chartered, and that somebody now owns it. Yet the Thames, which is representing nature, flows. It has agency, and so it cannot really be controlled or owned in the same sense as a plot of land can. By using this phrase, Blake has simultaneously acknowledged and ridiculed the increasing amount of control in London. The repetition of chartered really highlights the amount of control in London. By making it cover both land and water, it seems truly inescapable. Blake's criticism of London is really apparent in the bottom line of this stanza. The third line of the stanza means that he notices something in the face of everyone passing by. What is it that he notices? The image reveals that to us. Everybody in London is clearly weak and or sad. This seems to be connected to the idea of control, and that through being so overwhelmingly controlled, the people of London are powerless, unhappy, and depressed. The second quatrain, I hope, is fairly straightforward. I have 1, 2, 3 questions for it. There is a structure-based question to think about, as well as 2 based on imagery. As ever, pause now if you'd like to make your own annotations. Repetition almost always emphasizes the thing that's being repeated. Here, the word every has been emphasized. Now look, Blake, we get it. Everyone in London is miserable, from the old, as shown by man, to the young, shown by infant. The cause of this misery is not exactly explicit in these 3 lines, but we can assume that it's to do with how controlled they are, as that seems to be the overall message of this poem. London, and how controlling it is, makes people miserable. Before I explain that annotation in a bit more detail, I need to break down the language contained within the image. Hopefully you know what a mind is. Forged conjures up an image of a blacksmith and fire and metal in my mind, as forging is the creation of metal objects using fire to help. However, in this case, the fire and the furnace are the human mind. And what's being made in this mind fire? Manacles, which are basically handcuffs. This image suggests that it is the Londoners' minds that have been controlled, which is much, much more difficult to break out of than any physical restraint. Their hope and spirit have been crushed, and the city's control is total. Whereas the first stanza contains mostly visual imagery, oral imagery is abundant in this stanza. Men and children alike are crying. The effects of the mind-forged manacles, which represent the people's weakness, sadness, and lack of power, can also be heard in everyone's voice and in their bans, which can mean cursing. It's a lot harder to escape noises than it is to escape sights. If you see something that you don't like, you can look away from it. It's much harder, as far as I'm aware, to turn your hearing away from something and to hear in the opposite direction. Because sound is so difficult to escape, it means that London's control, or evidence of it, is also difficult to escape. There are 1, 2, 3 questions again that I think are useful to think about with regards to this quatrain. And again, if you want to make your own annotations, now is a good time for you to pause the video. You know those questions that were on your screen a moment ago? Well, you're going to have to wait a little bit longer to get the answers for them, because this is the end of part 1 of my analysis of William Blake's London. Now part 2 will be coming very soon, promise you that. But to make sure you don't miss out on that, why not subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell too, so that way you'll be alerted when part 2 drops. As ever, thank you for watching this video. I hope you have an awesome rest of the day, and I'll catch you very soon. Cheers.